האם זה באמת סגולה בדוקה? הסגולה ללמוד בזה?
Erev Tov, good evening, Dobro V'Yetzer. We are in the Zera Shimshon on Parshas Tetzei, and we're going to do section 6, Os Vav. Before we begin, we're going to take a look at a pasuk from our Parsha, and we're also going to define two terms, and then we'll be ready to begin in the Zera Shimshon text. So the pasuk comes from Parshas Tetzei, Perek Chav Gimel and Devarim, pasuk Gimel. Lo yovo mamzer b'kehal Hashem. A mamzer is not allowed to come into the congregation of Hashem. We'll talk about what that means in a moment. Gam dor asiri lo yovo lo b'kehal Hashem. Also, the 10th generation cannot come in for him b'kehal Hashem into the congregation of Hashem. So we're going to define what a mamzer is because there is confusion about that in many circles in a moment. But first, let's just try and understand the pasuk. However we define a mamzer, this pasuk is saying that a mamzer cannot enter the congregation of Hashem, which means a mamzer, a male mamzer, cannot marry a regular Jewish woman, and a female mamzeres cannot marry a regular Jewish man. As we'll see, they can, however, marry other mamzerim. So a male mamzer can marry a mamzeres, and a female mamzeres, can marry a mamzer. And we'll also see that there are other options for them. For example, they can marry converts, but they can't marry, quote unquote, a regular Jewish people. So what is a mamzer? Some people mistakenly think a mamzer is a person who is a child, let's say, born out of wedlock. In English, if we wanted to use a somewhat impolite word, we would say a bastard. But that is not what a mamzer is in Jewish law at all. A child born out of wedlock does not have the halachic status of a mamzer. A mamzer is a child born from two people who have relations who cannot possibly marry under Jewish law, and their being together is a very serious violation of Jewish law that would bring either kares or misa, or a death penalty. So let me give you an example. Let's imagine a case of incest where a brother and sister are together, and the sister becomes impregnated by her brother, and she gives birth to a child. That child is a mamzer because, as we just said a moment ago, a brother and sister can never marry in Jewish law, and them being together sexually is a very serious violation of the Torah, of Torah prohibitions, for which kares and the death penalty would apply. And the child of their union is therefore called a mamzer. Another example would be if a married woman is together with a man who not her husband, and they have a child, that child is considered a mamzer. If it's a boy, if it's a girl, it's a mamzeres. So now we understand that if a person is in fact the child, the mamzer, because of the child was born out of one of the unions we just described, then the pasuk is telling us that child, when he or she grows up, the mamzer or the mamzeres cannot marry a quote-unquote regular Jewish person, but could marry another mamzer, a person with also the same status under Jewish law, or could marry a convert, or, as we'll see, there might be a possibility of marrying an eved or a shifcha Kanani, a Canaanite slave or maidservant, when such a status and such a reality existed. So that's the term mamzer. The second term we need to define is a nesin, nun saf yud nun sofis, or netin, nun taf yud nun, depending on your pronunciation. So a nesin is a person who is a descendant of the Givonim, who are mentioned in Sefer Yehoshua in the 9th chapter of Sefer Yehoshua, Perek Tes. A very unusual, interesting, kind of fascinating episode happens where Yehoshua is conquering, and Bnei Yisrael, the Jewish people, are conquering the land of Israel, and they will not make peace with any of the nations that live in Israel that are native to the land. but a group of people shows up and says that they are from a far away land, and they are in Israel not because they ever lived there before, not because they were born there or were native to the land, but because they were foreigners from a different country, and they look like people. They have dressed themselves up and disguised themselves as people from a faraway place who've just suffered through a long trip and terrible privations, and Yehoshua believes them. And he says to them, I will not harm you. And he makes a vow that he will not harm them. And he says, I accept that you're not people of this land, and therefore I have no quarrel with you. But it turns out that he finds out they really are from the land. He refuses to break his promise to them, as some people encourage him to do. He says, no, I made a vow and I'm going to stand by it. And so he designates them as people who can live with the Jewish people, will not be harmed by the Jewish people, but they must be water carriers, wood choppers and water carriers, and have a special kind of status amongst the people. And they also rabbinically, from rabbinic law, are forbidden from marrying, quote unquote, regular Jewish men or Jewish women. That term nisin and nisinim in the plural will come up a little later in the section. So let's now get right in with that introductory material. Yevamos Perek Ches Daf Ayin Ches. In Meseches Yevamos, in the 8th chapter on page 78, Omar Rav Huna said, Mamzera lo chaye, a person who is a mamzer will not live. And in that Gemara, what he means is not that the person dies right away, that every mamzer dies immediately, but a mamzer will not live long enough to procreate and have children. That's what Rav Huna states. Gemara asks, V'ha'anon tenan, but did we not learn in a Mishnah, mamzerim asurim, mamzerim are forbidden to marry regular Jewish men and women, ve'isuron isur olam, and this prohibition is an eternal prohibition, meaning it doesn't just apply to the original mamzer or mamzeres, it applies to their offspring and future generations. That is the question that the Gemara asks on Rav Huna's opinion, because it's a clear contradiction. Rav Huna stated that people who have the halachic designation of mamzerim do not live to procreate and have children. And then we have a Mishnah that talks about the mamzerim living and having children and what happens to their future generations. Clear contradiction. So now, Zera Shimshon. Makshim, the commentators ask a question. Amai lo parich le mikra. Why did the Gemara in Yevamos that Zera Shimshon just quoted choose to ask a question on Rav Huna from a Mishnah? Why did it not ask from a pasuk in the Torah, namely the pasuk that we read a few moments ago? Dichsiv, as the pasuk says, lo yovo mamzer v'chulei, a mamzer cannot come into the congregation of Hashem, cannot marry a regular Jewish person. Gam dor asiri lo yovo lo b'kahal Hashem. Also, the 10th generation from the original mamzer is not allowed to come in for him to the congregation of Hashem. So the Zera Shimshon says that there's an obvious question to be asked, and the commentators ask it, which is, why would the Gemara ask a question of Rav Huna from a Mishnah when it apparently there's a clear pasuk in the Torah, our pasuk that talks about 10 generations. Well, in order to have a 10th generation mamzer or a 10th generation descendant from the original mamzer or mamzeres, obviously they have to live long enough to procreate, because even if you just have a second, third, fourth, fifth generation mamzer, that means the original mamzer lived long enough to have children, and now we're dealing with the second or third or fourth, or in this case, 10th generation. The pasuk clearly assumes that mamzerim can have children, and we can deal with 10 generations later from the original mamzer. Why did the Gemara not ask from a pasuk, which is certainly stronger, more powerful, against Rav Huna's opinion, and chose instead to ask from a Mishnah? So what the Zera Shimshon is going to do is give us 3 answers to that question. That's a very basic, straightforward question. Why would the Gemara choose to ask from a Mishnah and not a pasuk? Zera Shimshon is going to develop 3 different answers, and we need to really pay close attention, because they are, to understand these answers, you need to follow the logic, the language, and the logic and the terminology very closely. Here comes the beginning of the first answer. V'yesh lomar, and we can say, the Amrinan b'Meseches Kiddushin daf samech tes. We say in the Gemara of Meseches Kiddushin, Rabbi Tarfon Omer. Rabbi Tarfon says, we're going to see there are 3 opinions brought down in this Gemara about mamzerim. Rabbi Tarfon is the first opinion, and he says, Yecholim mamzerim litaher. Mamzerim are able to become purified, meaning they're able to remove the illegitimacy of the status of mamzerus from their progeny, from their children. Ketzad, how is this so? How can a mamzer remove the illegitimacy? Mamzer shenosa shifcha. If a mamzer marries a Canaanite maidservant, a non-Jewish maidservant back in ancient times, she would be called a shifcha Canaanis, a Canaanite maidservant, for example, after Yehoshua came into the land. Havlad Eved. So if they have a child, the mamzer and this Canaanite maidservant have a child, that child is considered an Eved. Shichruro, if his master frees him, Harei Zeh ben Chorin, then this is a freed person, a regular freed man who is considered Jewish and not a mamzer. So according to Rabbi Tarfon, a mamzer has a way out, so to speak, not in terms of himself. He will always be considered a mamzer, but or if it's a woman, a mamzeres. But they are able to have a child, and the child of a union between the mamzer and a shifcha Kananis or an eved Kanani, a manservant or a maidservant, non-Jewish man or maidservant, the child will be considered an eved, but not a mamzer. And then if he gets freed, then he's not even an eved anymore. He's a full-fledged Jewish person who can marry other regular, quote-unquote, Jewish people. So according to Rabbi Tarfon, that's the way out for a mamzer to help his children avoid the stigma, avoid the illegitimacy of mamzers. Now the next opinion in that Gemara. Rabbi Eliezer, Omer Rabbi Eliezer says, Hareze Eved mamzer. The child is an Eved and a mamzer. So the child has now both problems, both issues have passed on to the child. Because the father was a mamzer in this case, the child is a mamzer, according to Rabbi Eliezer, the second opinion. And because the mother was a shifcha, a maidservant, the child is an eved, the child is a servant. And so that's a Rabbi Eliezer clearly doesn't agree with Rabbi Tarfon. V'amrino b'Gemara, and we say in that Gemara in Kiddushin, the halacha ka Rabbi Tarfon. The Gemara says the law follows Rabbi Tarfon's opinion that the mamzer has a way out to free his child. If he marries a shifcha Kananis, then that child is an eved and not a mamzer, and later on can be freed and become a regular Jewish man. Umay taimei de Rabbi Eliezer. The Gemara says halacha follows Rabbi Tarfon, but what's the explanation for Rabbi Eliezer's viewpoint, who differs with Rabbi Tarfon? The Amar Kra, so the Gemara answers, because the pasuk that we read says lo, the word lo, which teaches us halech achar pisulo, go after his illegitimacy. We must follow his illegitimacy. In a moment, Zera Shimshon will bring Rashi to explain what this means. But first, let's just glance back at the end of the first paragraph where this pasuk is quoted. Lo yovo mamzer v'chulei, a mamzer cannot come into the congregation of Hashem. Gam dor asiri lo yovo lo b'kahal Hashem. This is not the word no, this is the word to him or for him. Also, the 10th generation cannot come to him or for him into the congregation of Hashem. That word lo seems to be completely superfluous, and it's not even clear how it should be translated there. He should not come in for him into the congregation of Hashem. So the Gemara says that's where Rabbi Eliezer gets his opinion, because of that seemingly and hard to understand superfluous word lo for him. Halech achar pisulo, we have to follow after his illegitimacy. Uperish Rashi. Rashi explains, what does this mean? Afilu ein bo tzad mamzerus ela me'oso. This means that even if the child only has an element of mamzerus, not from both parents, but only from him, dahainu mitzad ha'av, which means from the side of the father. So Rabbi Eliezer says, I understand that the mamzer married a shivcha Kananis, and she does not have the status of a mamzeres. Nonetheless, the word lo for him teaches me that even though the child of that union is only receiving, so to speak, mamzeres status from his father, nonetheless, he's considered a mamzer, and he doesn't lose the mamzeres status. So he, according to Rabbi Eliezer, he is both an eved and a mamzer. That's how the Gemara explains Rabbi Eliezer's viewpoint. V'Rabbanon, and the rabbis who have the third opinion in the Gemara over there, Hahu b'Yisrael she'nosa mamzeres. They say what it's referring to is if a Jewish man marries a mamzeres, the child, even though only his mother is a mamzeres, but not his father, is considered a mamzer, and it's inescapable, and the child is considered a mamzer. So that's how Rabbanon learn out the meaning of the word lo. Even though it says to him, it actually is teaching us about law. To her, the mother's a mamzeres, then the child is a mamzeres. Let's continue. Next page, top of the column on the right. V'im kain, if so, if the Gemara had asked on Rev Huna's opinion from that pasuk, he would have been able to push aside the question. Pasuk Maire b'mamzer mitzad ha'av bilvad, because Rev Huna could have said, if the Gemara asked on his opinion from the pasuk, he could have said, no. Don't worry about that pasuk. I have no problem with the pasuk, because the pasuk is talking specifically about a type of mamzer who is only a mamzer from his father's side, not his mother's side. Rabbi Eliezer, according to the view of Rabbi Eliezer, that such a child is considered a mamzer. O mitzad ha'em bilvad, or also maybe the pasuk's referring to a child of a union when only the mother has mamzera status. Rabbanon, according to the view of the Rabbanon, who say that such a child is a mamzer even though only the mother is a mamzeres. Vehahu chaye, and Rav Huna would say, the reason the pasuk talks about 10 generations later still having mamzeres in the family is because that type of mamzer, who's only a one-sided mamzer, so to speak, can live. I never said that those types of people can't live and procreate. Hoil she'eno mamzer ela mitzad echad, because they are not full mamzerim. They're only mamzerim from one parent. V'daika nami, and this also makes sense in the pasuk. The Samoch Lador Asiri Kosav Milas Lo. In the pasuk, near the words that talk about the 10th generation mamzer, it's written the word lo, to him. The mashma mine, we can learn out from that, we can infer from that, mamzer mitzad ha'av bilvad. The pasuk is saying this child, this mamzer who has mamzeriv's children and progeny 10 generations later, was only for him, was only a mamzer on the father's side, not both parents. The Rav Huna, Maire b'mamzer gomar. Rav Huna would say, I'm not talking about those kinds of, so to speak, half mamzerim or one-sided mamzerim. I'm talking about complete mamzerim. Tehahu lo chaye. Those types of mamzerim do not survive to be able to give birth to children. So if the Gemara had asked from the pasuk, Rav Huna would have been able to swipe the question away, to avoid the question and have a very good answer for it. But now that we have a Mishnah which teaches the law openly, plainly, mamzerim unisinim asurim v'isuron isur olam, mamzerim, and Nesinim, and those people that Yehoshua accepted into Bnei Yisrael and later on became rabbinically prohibited from marrying quote-unquote regular Jews, are totally prohibited for future generations. The mashma kol min mamzer. This implies every type of mamzer. Mikol shkein de ketani lo bahade hilchasa. How much more so when the Mishnah taught along with mamzerim the halacha of the nesinim. Psiksa de nesinim b'chule. The law, the decided law regarding nesinim. And nesinim, there aren't different types of nesinim that we can distinguish between one-sided nesinim and two-sided nesinim, or half nesinim and full nesinim. And in the Mishnah, that type of approach to answer would never work, because the Mishnah just states simply all mamzerim and all nesinim are forbidden, and the prohibition applies not just to them but to their offspring. So that's what makes the Mishnah the most preferable source to ask a question instead of our pasuk, which could be learned in different ways. Mishum hochi parech le mimas nisin dafka. Because of this, the Gemara specifically and Yevama specifically asks from the Mishnah that it quotes, and not from the pasuk. Let's pause here for a moment. So this is the end of the first answer that the Zera Shimshon is giving to his question, and all three answers will be devoted to that same original question. Why did the Gemara ask a question from a Mishnah and not from the pasuk? And he's answered and said, because the pasuk could be interpreted by Rav Huna in legitimate ways to be talking about half or one-sided mamzerim, and therefore it mentions 10 generations, because Rav Huna would say those types of mamzerim can live and give birth to future generations. But Rav Huna would argue, I'm talking about full mamzerim, and those are the ones who I'm saying do not live and do not bring future children into the world. And that's why the Gemara says, sorry, that's not going to work with the Mishnah. The Mishnah clearly talks about all mamzerim and all nesinim, doesn't matter, half, full, whatever, and all of them are forbidden even for future generations, which means the Mishnah believes they can have future generations, which contradicts Rav Huna. That's the first answer. Second, next paragraph. V'od yesh lomar, and we can also say another answer. The hoil de ika gam Rabbi Eliezer, since there is this view of Rabbi Eliezer, the svira le kerav Huna, the mamzera lo chaye, who holds in accordance with Rav Huna's view that mamzerim do not survive to give birth to future generations, mishum hachi ein lahakshos l'Rav Huna mehapasuk. Because of that, since Rabbi Eliezer is of the same opinion, you can't ask on Rav Huna. The Gemara chose not to ask on Rav Huna from a pasuk Gam Dor Asiri that talked about the 10th generation after the original mamzer. Mipnei shemeha pasuk koshanami leRabbi Eliezer, because from that pasuk you could also ask on Rabbi Eliezer. Ubevadai sheyihi lo eze terutz. We know it's safe to assume that Rabbi Eliezer would never express an opinion that goes against the pasuk, so certainly he has an answer. Ve'af Rav Huna yisaretz hapasuk k'moshe yisaretz Rabbi Eliezer. So however Rabbi Eliezer could answer the question, Rav Huna will say, I embrace that same answer. This is an unusual approach. It's going to continue in a moment, but this is a very unusual approach. What the Zera Shimshon is saying is that if you have a question from a pasuk on a Tana is like Rabbi Eliezer, is one of the great scholars from the time of the Mishnah, then there's no need. You can't push that question too far, because we can assume that no Tana would ever state an opinion that would contradict a pasuk. So obviously Rabbi Eliezer would have an explanation for the pasuk in the Torah to show us why his opinion the pasuk doesn't contradict or impair his opinion. However, Rav Huna, when he states the opinion, if you were to try and ask from a pasuk, he could just say, Rabbi Eliezer shares my opinion, and the way he explains the pasuk, that's how I also explain the pasuk, even though the Zera Shimshon doesn't spell out what answer Rabbi Eliezer would give that Rav Huna would embrace. But let's continue. Aval mimas nisan shapir kol maksha. But from our Mishnah, meaning not from the pasuk, which they could answer, but from our Mishnah, it's a good question. Shahar mimas nisan leka lahakshos leRebbi Eliezer. You can't ask from the Mishnah on Rebbe Eliezer to Hatanahu Upoleg. He is a Tana. He is of equal stature to the other great rabbis mentioned, the other great Tanoim mentioned in the Mishnah, in all of the Mishnayos, and he's entitled to argue against them. So you can't say to any Tana, in this case Rebbe Eliezer, you can't say, we have a question on you from a Mishnah because, as it states, as the Zera Shimshon quoted, Tanahu Upolig, that's a rule in the Gemara. A Tana and a scholar from the time of the Mishnah can argue on other Mishnayot because the Mishnayot just reflect and contain opinions of other people of equal stature. Aval Rav Huna parich mistama demas nisan. But on Rav Huna, we can ask from this plain Mishnah, this open Mishnah, the Hilchasahi, because it is stating the halacha. And Rav Huna, is an Amora. He's a scholar of a later time period, of the time period of the Gemara. The Gemara sages were called Amoraim, and they can't argue against the Mishnah. V'leka lemeimar desfira le'karabi Eliezer, and you can't say, oh, Rav Huna's following Rabbi Eliezer, and he's a Tana, so Rav Huna's okay. Why can't you do that? Mishum dishamutihu, because he is a shamuti. We'll talk about the two explanations of that word in a moment. V'leis hilchasa kavase, and the halacha does not follow after him. So Rav Huna can't just say, I choose to go against that Mishnah and I follow Rabbi Eliezer because Rabbi Eliezer is a Tana and he can argue against the Mishnah, so I'm just going with him. Rav Huna, the scholar of later generations, can't do that because Rabbi Eliezer is a Shamuti. That could mean that Rabbi Eliezer was a member of the school and the followers of Beit Shammai. That's what it means, Shamuti. And we know that in general, the law follows Beit Hillel instead of Beit Shammai. So that means Rav Huna would not be getting a lot of help from saying, I'm following Rabbi Eliezer, who's a member of the Beit Shammai school, when the halacha generally goes against Beit Shammai school and follows Beit Hillel. That's one opinion of what that means, one explanation. Another opinion is that Rabbi Eliezer, at a certain point of his life, was put into cherem by the other rabbis. He was put into a type of excommunication. And the word shamuti can refer to that. And according to that explanation, the Gemara is saying Rav Huna can't say I follow like Rabbi Eliezer because he was put into cherem v'leis hilchos kavase, and the halacha doesn't follow the opinion who can't communicate of a person who can't communicate with the rabbis and explain and defend his opinion. Rav Huna di'ihu Amora, continuing in the Zera Shimshon, Rav Huna, who is an Amora, scholar of the time of the Gemara, yeshlo ledaktek velomar devorav aliba dehilchasa. He has to be careful and state his opinions according and following the law. He can't. Amoraim should not make statements, the Zera Shimshon is saying, that can't be based on support from Tanoim, from earlier scholars, that the halacha follows. That ends the second answer. Now let's go to the top of the column on the left for the third answer. The Yesh Lomar, and we can say V'o Yesh Lomar, and we can also say Shekosav HaRambam Perek Tes Vav Mehilchos Isurei Bia. The Rambam, Maimonides, wrote in his Mishnah Torah, his great magnum opus of Jewish law, in the 15th chapter of Isurei Bia, forbidden relations, he wrote, this is a quote, Din Torah, the law of the Torah is, Shesofeg mamzer muter lavo bekahal. According to Torah law, if a person is a doubtful mamzer, whatever the conditions are that created some question about this person, it's doubtful. We don't know for sure if a person's a mamzer, but we have a doubt, a safek. That person can marry a quote-unquote regular Jewish person. It's not forbidden. Shenemar, as the Torah says, lo yovo mamzer. A mamzer can't come into the congregation of Hashem. Mamzer vadai hu de lo yovo. It's a definite mamzer who the Torah is talking about who can't come in and marry a Jewish woman. Aval mamzer sofek yovo, but a person who's only a doubtful mamzer, we're not sure, and we have no way of determining if that person is truly a mamzer or not, that person can marry a Jewish woman according to Torah law. Ela shechachomim gozru af al hasofik, but the chachomim made a decree that even a mamzer who's in this condition of being a mamzer sofek, a sofek mamzer, a doubtful mamzer, the chachomim said even such a person is prohibited from marrying a quote unquote regular Jewish individual, and is treated in terms of marriage like a full-fledged mamzer, a vadai mamzer. V'im kain, and if so, Yesha'omar Rav Huna mamzera lo chaye, when Rav Huna said his original statement that mamzerim don't live to procreate, hayinu yecholin lomar, we could have said the mayre besafek mamzer. Maybe Rav Huna, we could have suggested that Rav Huna is only talking about a doubtful mamzer, shehu mamzer derabanan, who's only considered only rabbinically considered a mamzer and only forbidden from marrying a Jewish woman, a regular Jewish woman rabbinically. V'yesh svara lomar kain, and there's a good reason to think that. De'iyah marta mayre b'mamzer vadai, because if you say that Rav Huna was talking about even definite mamzerim aren't going to be allowed to live long. They're not, in other words, by Shamayim, they're not going to be allowed to live long until they're able to have children. Ma'ishna mamzer mishar psulei bakahal. What would be the difference between a mamzer and other people who are forbidden to marry Jewish women and come and enter the congregation of Hashem? Shehem chayim v'zelo chaye? Or does it make sense that Rav Huna would say all the other types of people mentioned in the Torah who can't marry a Jewish woman, no matter what they do, they are allowed to live and continue living, but zeh lo chai, but this mamzer, vadai, this definite mamzer is not allowed to live. That doesn't make sense. Ela vadai de mayri b'mamzer midrabanan, but definitely we would think that Rav Huna was talking about, when he said a mamzer is not allowed to live, he was talking about a mamzer, rabbinic mamzer, v'hoyel shu sofek, and since his status is doubtful, yesh lochu shema yitama, we have a doubt, we have a concern, sorry, not a doubt, we have a concern, we should have a concern, shema, maybe yitama, he will intermarry, he will marry a regular Jewish woman, v'lo yisrachaku mimeno legamre, and people will not distance themselves from him, lefi sheyu mekilim bo, because they're going to be lenient. The dilma ain't no mamzer. Perhaps he's not a mamzer, right? If a person is a suffix mamzer, his status is doubtful, and let's say he's a personal, charming individual, or even better, a personal, charming, rich individual, there are certainly going to be people who would like to marry him, and they'll say, he's not even a mamzer. He's a suffix mamzer. It's a doubt. Let's assume he's not really a mamzer. Umishum hachi lo chaye, and that's why Rav Huna said from heaven they will not allow him to live long, because there's a real concern that people will accept him into the eligible bachelor pool or bachelorette pool, and these people, the suffix mamzer or the suffix mamzeres, will end up getting married and having children because people will marry them. Omnam, however, mamzer vadai, someone who's definitely a mamzer, shenoda v'nikar pisula, whose legitimacy is well established, ubevadai sheyisrachaku mimenu, and certainly everyone will separate from him, meaning regular Jewish people regular Jewish women who can't marry the man, or regular Jewish men who can't marry the mamzeris woman. Ze yuchalichios, such a person would be allowed to live, because there's no reason that min hashamayim they would end the person's life before the person can procreate. Nobody would, who's forbidden to marry the mamzer or the mamzeris, would do so. But a suffix mamzer, we might think, would be a dangerous person, so to speak, to have around for too long. And so min hashamayim, because people would be lenient about his or her status. And so min hashamayim, perhaps Rav Huna was saying the person would not be allowed to live long enough to procreate. Next paragraph. Umishum hachi, and because of this, lo hiksha meha pasuk, the Gemara chose not to ask a question from the pasuk of lo yovo mamzer, our pasuk from the very beginning about a mamzer cannot enter the congregation of Hashem, the mayre b'mamzer vadai, because Rav Huna would just say that pasuk is talking about a definite mamzer. Rav Huna mayre b'mamzer safek, and I, Rav Huna, I'm talking about a doubtful mamzer. In the Torah, it talked about someone who can live a long life and give birth to children, and 10 generations later, all those later generations, it came from the original person with the status of a mamzer or a mamzeres. That's what the pasuk's talking about. But Rav Huna would say, when I say a mamzer can't live long enough to even have one child, I'm talking about a doubtful mamzer, shehu midrabanan, who is forbidden to marry Jewish women only rabbinically, elehikshim nisan. But rather, the Gemara chose to ask from a better source in this very unique situation, which is from a Mishnah, Diktani le bahade nisinim, because it talked about mamzerim being forbidden forever, along with the nisinim, the people from the time of Yoshua, the water carriers and the wood choppers. Disnan, because it taught in the Mishnah, mamzerim unisinim asurim, mamzerim and nisinim are forbidden to marry regular Jewish people. Nisinim vadai shehem midrabana. Nisinim certainly are only prohibited rabbinically. Va'af mamzerim, and so too mamzerim. Dikatani nami hainu af mamzer derabanan. So we know that when it talks about mamzerim and nisinim, it's talking about even if they're only prohibited rabbinically. Nisinim are only prohibited rabbinically, and it includes mamzerim with them, which means even when a mamzer is only prohibited rabbinically. The Ketani Isurun Isur. In the Mishnah teaches that their prohibition applies forever, even after children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, etc. Alma Chaye, this shows us that they can live to procreate. So that's the third explanation. So now the Zera Shimshon has given us three different explanations as to why the Gemara chose to ask a question on Rav Huna about his opinion, his viewpoint, seemingly contradicting his viewpoint from a Mishnah as opposed to asking from the pasuk in the Torah. And now to wrap up, the Zera Shimshon says, now let me tell you what the Gemara answers for Rav Huna, on behalf of Rav Huna. The Seirates, it answers didia velo yidia. We're talking about where it's known, where the determining factor is whether it's known or not known. De'ein hadover toloi b'safek. The whole issue is not an issue of whether someone's a doubtful mamzer or a definite mamzer, ela b'yedias b'nei adam. But rather, Rav Huna holds it has to do with the knowledge of people. How widely is it known that this individual is a mamzer? Zera Shimshon doesn't go on to explain, but what this means is the way that ultimately the Gemara answers for Rav Huna is that when Rav Huna looks at the pasuk, and the pasuk in the Torah, again, that we started with in the beginning of this section, talks about 10 generations after the original mamzer, which clearly shows us that a mamzer can live and have children. That's talking about where the mamzer status was diadia, it was known. And Rav Huna believes that if a mamzer status is known, then that person can live because there's no danger of intermarriage, even if the person's status is suffix mamzer. If that's known, then that's the determining factor. It's not a question, an issue of suffix, it's an issue of how well it's known. However, if a mamzer status is not known, whether it's a vadai mamzer or a suffix mamzer or any kind of mamzer, if the status, even going back to the beginning, a one-sided or half mamzer, whatever the case is, if it's not known and there's a danger of people marrying that person, then Rav Huna is of the opinion, lo chaye, that person will not be allowed to continue living because the danger to the community is too great that he will procreate and have bring more mamzerim into the world, and people will not know to avoid marrying this person because lo yediyah, his status is not known. But if a mamzer status is known, then Rav Huna says there's no reason for Shamayim to, so to speak, take action in terms of having him die before he can have children. So the Zera Shimshon here has gone into a pretty arcane topic. It's not usual for us to talk a lot about mamzerus, the whole issue of mamzerus, and certainly illegitimacy, and certainly not about nesinim, this group of people that Yoshua dealt with, and that their descendants were still around long after, and they served as wood choppers and water carriers for the Mishkan, and later on for the Beis Hamikdash. So they became ingrained in part of the Jewish people, but their special rules applied to them, as special rules also applied to the mamzerim. Yashu Koch for joining us and learning in the Zera Shimshon this week. We look forward, God willing, to learning again in the Zera Shimshon on next week's Parsha.